wheels for a few seconds to allow a few more people to trickle in. So I'm going to start by saying who I am on the camera officially. I am Maggie Dennis. I am the Vice President of Community Resilience and Sustainability. I've been at the foundation for 9 years. I've been a participant in the movement for more than that as user Moonwritten Girl. My work encompasses trust and safety, as well as a few other divisions of the foundation's focus points. That wasn't as articulate as I wanted it to be, but I'm winging it as I go. So I'm having a hard time spinning my wheels for a few minutes. Maybe I'll pause awkwardly. All right, I'm just going to go ahead. I can't spin my wheels for that long. I'm very, very bad with awkward silences. So I just wanted to set out what I'm here to talk about briefly and to reiterate some of my, my conditions, basically. So I'm here to talk about the work that my team and I do. We are situated in the legal department. As I said, we do trust and safety. Some of you are aware that I'm hiring a human rights lead. I believe I mentioned that in my email. I think about community resilience and sustainability and ways that we can help improve that. Although this is a fairly new role for me, so I'm still on the ground floor of some of that thinking. I am able to talk about any work that my team is doing. I can talk about things more broadly, but I'm afraid that if you're here for answers about work being done by other teams, I probably won't be useful to you. I'll have to tell you who you can talk to. I will talk to anybody who has a question who is in good standing in the movement. If you're banned on a project, I won't be able to engage with you. And I will answer any question that is presented in a civil and cordial manner. I do have to ask you to be respectful to me, to other staff, to other volunteers, and I will do my best to answer you with transparency and honesty. So there we go. Those are my rules of engagement. I'm very nervous. I will try to pretend that I am not throughout this call, but I am. So excuse me if I stumble with my words. If I'm not clear about something, I'm completely okay for you to ask clarifying questions. And Elena has very kindly agreed again to come and support with these questions. She's really good at reading them off and she helps me keep calm. So Elena.
You're doing great keeping calm so far.
Thank you.
Big compliments. So hi, everybody. Thanks to those of you who are joining us live, and hi to those of you watching us after the fact. We're going to take written questions from IRC and YouTube and Telegram, and also here in the Zoom room. But if you are in the Zoom room and you want to ask a question verbally rather than written, that's great. You're free to do that too. Just raise your hand in the Zoom room, or you can raise your hand in the chat, either through the function of hand raise or through the chat is fine. And I will work you into the queue so that you can ask your question. Just a reminder that if you do decide to speak in the Zoom room, keep your questions succinct in the interest of time. I really don't want to interrupt your question or your preamble or your context for your question. So if we keep it succinct and we keep it respectful, then I will not have to interrupt you at all and you will get the floor all to yourself. So that's just that quick reminder. I think with that, we can dive into some of the questions. We have a few that were submitted ahead of time. So we'll start with those. The first question, Maggie, is about the new human rights lead position. Why are you hiring a human rights lead, and what exactly is that person going to be doing?
So the Wikimedia movement, as I'm sure everyone who's here is aware, encompasses a lot of communities around the world facing different challenges. We are finding as we grow, and particularly as we look to grow into regions where we haven't had a strong presence in the past, that there's increasing attention on volunteers who work in some areas from organizations, some of whom are not extremely friendly. I'm sorry, I'm trying not to be too awfully explicit here, but essentially I think the hint is in the title of the job. So some people do face human rights threats related to their involvement in the movement. The ability to speak truth on the internet, to share information is a very powerful thing. And there are some people who want to control the story that is told and who look to target users in negative ways for what they're actually saying. So we are hiring somebody whose job it is to help people who encounter problems as a result of their good faith participation in the movement, help them understand, help them connect with local organizations that can support their human rights. And we are also looking for somebody who can help them understand how to engage safely. How do you avoid exposing private information such that they can find you? How do we engage in a way that allows them to feel safe and confident in telling the truth and sharing information, but still not become targeted?
Thanks for that. The next question is around your team's scope. So on MetaWiki, it says that your team is intended to expand in order to include the management of crisis response as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. So the question is, what are your goals with this, and how is this different from what your current team does?
Okay, so crisis response was the title of human rights. So effectively, the crisis response is human rights. We just were not quite as open in the title as what we were looking for. We also, at one point, were considering more types of crises, like, for example, if a global pandemic hits, that was obviously a much broader mandate. But when it came time for us to be doing hiring, we found out that human rights expertise and general crisis response don't always live in the same person. So I need to update Meta. Crisis response is not current. It is human rights now. In terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, well, before the COVID crisis hit, I probably need to update that too. Before the COVID crisis hit, we were hoping to explore ways to work with community groups around filling in content gaps in areas like women's health around the world in different languages. We know that much of our content is grown organically. People come in, they write about what they feel like writing about, but that means that some people who come to look for important topics in some languages don't find them. So we were hoping to be able to work with some of our affiliate groups, work with our community programs group in ways that we could put out a call. This is missing in this language. This is important information that people can't get access to. Right now, we're not planning to move forward with that, but I hope that this is some work that we can pick up later. The COVID crisis has caused us to kind of narrow some of our scoping for this year, but it's definitely something that I still hope that we can continue to do. Did I cover all those questions?
Yeah, so I think you covered what the ultimate goal would be with each of those positions. Why is that kind of, I mean, the second question was, how is that different from what your current team is doing? So how would that type of work add capacity to your current team?
Okay, well, currently I have trust and safety, which is a kind of a 3-wing group. And although this hasn't been made public yet, community development has just moved under my section as well. So currently, my staff are working towards handling issues as they occur, the operations team, around helping to evolve policy, the Universal Code of Conduct team, and around anti-harassment tooling. So this is a close partnership with our product team to create different programs that can help people cope with issues as they occur. And over on the community development side, we are working towards creating, for example, an online training platform that will allow people to easily access materials to help train them in their activities. And there is capacity development work being done in emerging communities, especially. So I think telling you what my current teams do probably makes it clear how they're different, but if anybody has a follow-up question, I don't know who asked that, then I'm happy to dig more into it.
Yeah, thank you for that explanation. Okay, great. So the next question has to do with the Universal Code of Conduct consultation. How did you handle the timing of the UCOC consultation for those communities where the language translations came in late?
So guess what, Pat? I'm going to pass the mic to you since this is a process question. Everybody, this is Pat. He is the manager of the Trust and Safety Policy Wing. And if you can answer the process question, I'd appreciate it.
Absolutely. And so, yeah, and I want to give my thanks to anyone in the room or who was watching who took part in that community review. It was very well attended, and the committee was super happy about the really useful feedback that was given there. There's a lot of improvements made. The translations were a super big challenge. We tried to get as many languages as possible. We shot for 30. I think we were fairly successful, but the logistics, I think any Wikimedian who's worked with that wonderful thing called the translation extension knows that you can't move too quickly in terms of getting translations up. And so admittedly, we had some translations that didn't get up until the third day of the consultation or the fourth day. And so how we handled that towards the end was that we did a rolling closure of the consultation. So we closed the English one, the English language one on Meta first, because it was the first one available. And we closed the other ones over the next couple of days. But we definitely didn't want to shut down any conversation that was, still moving. So we definitely looked for ones where there was still a discussion happening and left that open. But yeah, it's something that we're thinking about for our future work, is how to avoid these bottlenecks, how to get everything in a row before we launch so that we can do things cleanly and not disadvantage anyone. But yeah, that's sort of how we handled it.
Great, thank you for that. So waiting on some more questions to come in from the queue. In the meantime, if there is anybody who wants to unmute and ask a question in the Zoom room, you are absolutely free to do that. Or if anybody who's been participating in the UCOC discussions or worked on that wants to talk about their experience, of course, it's welcome also. We'll wait for a couple minutes and see if anybody wants to unmute. I know Maggie doesn't like the awkward silence. Maggie, you're not responsible for this awkward silence. This is my sole responsibility. I'll wait a few more seconds. In the meantime, we do have a couple of other questions coming in writing.
For those who don't know, we have a couple of people scattered at different points collecting questions. So over YouTube, IRC, I didn't even remember where they're all coming from.
Telegram.
So, Telegram.
Room,
Yes.
via email. We're all over many channels. Okay, great. So this is actually kind of a more personal question for Maggie. What is the strangest request you have ever received, either as a volunteer or a staff member, from someone outside the movement?
So when I was hired at the foundation by Philippe Boudet, who used to say that someday he was going to write a book about some of the weird stuff that has come in. And I think one of the strangest things I ever saw was one that came early in my tenure, where I don't know who he was outside the movement, but a man in, I think he was in Germany, wrote us and offered to be I'm blanking on the term, a mercenary for the foundation. If we needed anybody to go on violent missions for us, he was ready and able. So we put that in the do not respond to this pile, because you don't want to respond to people who volunteer up front to be armed and dangerous. But I think that's probably the strangest request I ever got, a job as a mercenary for the foundation. We've had some weird stuff though. Oh, we've had some weird stuff.
Fascinating. Okay, great. So this question is actually aimed towards volunteers in the US. What recommendations would you make, Maggie, to the communities as we prepare for the upcoming elections in the US?
I'd say watch for disinformation. I mean, I know you already do. I used to do recent change patrol myself. So this is contentious. There's a lot of lies flying around. And I'm sure that's not just in the US elections, but all around the world. There are people who are trying to control information that other people receive to get the outcomes they want. I would say, I guess I would say this: when I was doing recent change patrol 10 years ago, it was pretty obvious most of the time when people were coming in and vandalizing or when they were twisting content for their own purposes. I think they're smarter about that now than they used to be. I think that disinformation campaigns have gotten a lot more sophisticated, and it can be really hard to determine at a glance what's valid or not. So if I were doing recent changes patrol, I probably would start looking for, I'd probably start glancing more at the sources used for political stuff just to make sure.
Thank you. Okay, so back to the UCOC. What is something that you or your team hopes comes from the UCOC that might not be on our minds already as we discuss the topic?
My problem with that question is in the word something. If it was some things, it would be easy for me. But when somebody asks me a something question, I always have to go, what's most important? What's most important? So I'm not sure if I can tell you a thing, but I'll riff on it and I'll try to keep it brief because I know there's at least one more question waiting. It can be challenging to move between projects. And I'm not sure that people who spend most of their time contributing to one project understand the challenges that some people have faced moving from one to another. So I hope that the UCOC will make it easier for people who want to move from one project to move into another space and know what the rules are. So rules of how to get along with other people. Because I think that from what I hear from the community, that is a pain point that isn't always well understood. I guess the other thing is I want there, this is my goal, I want there to be a good, clear process where communities know that their concerns are taken seriously, are handled, and as much as possible by peers. I've heard from enough people that I think there's a perception that trust and safety operations wants to take care of behavioral problems between users. And I myself do not want this. It's a very small team and I'd rather be able to focus them on the stuff that I don't think volunteers should do. I'm happy to think more if there's other questions about that, but that's what I come up with off the top of my head.
Yeah, those two things are helpful. Cool. Another question about the UCOC in the queue. Even though we're not in the implementation phase of the UCOC yet, how is the TNS team planning to navigate the trust gap between the foundation and the larger movement?
This is part of it. I think having conversations where people have access to ask their questions, who can talk to the people who are doing the work, is helpful. But beyond that, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. So the trust gap is on many levels and many different ways. So I think as much as possible by making sure that the questions we consider in phase 2, the implementation exploration, make sense to people and that people are able to engage with them in a way that feels like they're actually clearly shaping a direction together, and that the systems that we come up with don't concentrate power in the hands of the foundation, which I think, as I said a minute ago, would be not the right way to go forward. So hopefully that will help. And hopefully it will help that we are coming out more to talk and talk plainly. And hopefully it helps that we have a case review committee. I know there are limitations to how much help can come from that, but my goal is to try to move into a safer and trusting space myself, and hope that we can build together towards better trust.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm curious to know, like, trust, you know, this if done well, this will be a trust building exercise. And I'm curious to know, like, what obstacles exist if the trust isn't built and we move towards implementation. Like, what are the signs that you might perceive that we need to go back and move a little slower and do things a little bit more publicly? Or what are the potential red flags that you'll be keeping your eye out for in terms of making sure that everybody's brought along and that we're doing this in a way that does build trust and does build community?
Well, I guess for me, one of the most important things is that we are there and listening, and that we are paying attention to the kind of pain points people bring up, and that we are openly and candidly addressing those. Now, I will say I'm not the policy team, so I'm not the one who's putting together the project plan. So there's probably actual red flags that they're building into it. But for me, it's mostly around, I've already asked the board, please be flexible in this, and they know that this has to work for everybody. If it doesn't work for everybody, then it's not useful. So now that I've said that, I'm going to back up and say, that doesn't mean that I think everybody has to agree or approve, because let's face it, this is hard work. And not everybody is going to like what we come up with. The question is it still fair? Is it still servicing the movement? Is it still servicing the people in the movement? Why don't they like it? That's the question.
Yep. Yeah, I think keeping that question in mind and just keep continuing to loop back to that is a really good solution. Okay. Now turning to events and outreach. This question is still being pasted. 1 second. Are there any plans for outreach events for those who are not comfortable in English in terms of projects or policies?
Yeah, although I'm going to pass that off to Patrick, because he can talk about what the plans are. They are still evolving.
Mm-hmm. So sorry, the question is if there's any sort of meeting or outreach events who are not comfortable. Yes. So I'll be honest that the foundation has used the sort of meta model a lot of times for, documentation and conversations, and sort of left it up to fate whether translations were made, whether folks from other communities had a way to get their feelings in, and even then there had to be some bilingualism usually, and so we were, even when we're talking to non-English speakers, we were quite often talking to folks who had some English, and so for UCOC we realized that that's not going to work. That many of the communities who don't have conduct policies are definitely not English speaking. And so last time we went out and talked to about 19 communities, and we hired folks who had experience in those communities and spoke those languages. And we asked them to go out to talk to people where they were feeling more comfortable talking. So not just put a post on a notice board, but find out where people talk naturally. Are they talking on Telegram? Are they talking on Facebook, on a mailing list? So really trying to diversify the conversation spaces and the languages that we're having them in. And so the plan for phase 2 has a very similar element, and we want to do it more and we want to do it better. Is talk to people locally in their own language. Have people working with them who have context, who have enough context to ask the right questions and follow up with folks. And so yeah, we'd like to publish our plan as soon as possible. We'll do our best to get it in the next few weeks, hopefully, with more detail about where we're talking and how. But we definitely don't want to use just the hey, come to Meta and talk model. That won't be it. And we're definitely looking at sort of facilitated conversations online. I don't know how everyone else feels about Zoom. It can be draining, but the fact that we can't get together in person anymore means that we have to make it work. And so we're definitely planning a lot of inclusive conversations through wonderful platforms like Zoom. But we'll do our best to make them as pain-free as possible. But yeah, hopefully that mostly answers the question. I think that's from Rajiv.
Yeah, Rajiv's nodding, so I think he got his question answered. Feel free to unmute, Rajiv, if you have a follow-up question to that. I see you putting down your microphone, so I'm thinking maybe you are going to ask a follow-up question.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Pat, and thank you for the answer. Yes, as I've been working for local communities, I feel that speaking or understanding English is a bit uncomfortable, or it's not the smooth riding for people to express themselves. So I was looking for more about regional languages to work on, so that we can have more participation. So definitely I will be looking for the updates from your end, from what the foundation is looking for. Thank you for the
Yeah,
answers.
if you've been to the Universal Code of Conduct page on Meta, that's a great place to add to your watch list. That's where we'll be publishing updates there. But I just want to mention one other sort of focus is that when we can't talk to all the languages at once, just due to practicality, we need to look at the other secondary languages in the world. And so in many parts of the world, French is a secondary language. In many parts of the world, Arabic is a secondary language, Russian. So making sure that at base, at least those are covered, so that bilingual folks who cross over those lines can have the conversations. But yeah, we need to do more of this work at the foundation, and I hope that this project can be an improvement on how we do it. But thanks for your question. Yeah.
Thanks, Patrick and Rajiv. We have another question in the Zoom room now from Geert. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, okay. So I am wondering, why do we need a universal code of conduct when there exists something like etiquette that I know since I was 5 years old. Now I'm 55 years further in life. So yeah, why do we need universal code of conduct?
Well, part of the problem is, and the reason why I think we need it, because obviously this was a recommendation from the movement strategy group. So, so I'm speaking for myself, not for them, is there's a lot of lack of clarity from some people about what kind of conduct is permitted. And this is a problem both for people who come into a community and don't know how they should expect to be treated, and people who come into a community and don't know how they're expected to treat others. So in my opinion, a code of conduct is useful to the extent that it allows people to say, this is the way that I'm supposed to behave, and this is the way I'm not supposed to behave. As I mentioned, there's a lot of confusion as well we hear about from people who move between communities. I've seen clashes where communities have come together in kind of shared spaces with saying, this is not the way we act here, this is not the way we act there. So to me, the code of conduct is also useful to help with international engagement, with the blending of cultures in the way that we sometimes do. Some local communities seem to need and want them more than others. One of the early things that the policy team did was reach out to some communities to say, what do you have in terms of codes of conduct? Do you think a code of conduct would be useful to you? Some of them have copied them from other projects. Other people just don't have very much. And I'm going to be really super honest here, and even though this is recorded, but we know also that there are some projects that have been infiltrated by people who aren't necessarily working in the best of faith. And the code of conduct can help make sure that the people who develop power within a certain community are also adhering to behavior, and potentially help with raising the attention of the international community when that happens. So that's my thought. But in terms of the actual reasons behind the recommendation, that's probably written in the movement strategy documents, but we can probably get that for you.
Did that answer your question here? Do you have any follow-up to that?
Yes, okay, but yeah, it answers, but my experience, personal experience in life is that normal people behave being responsible and being welcoming and being respectful to others. So does this mean that the Wikimedia movement or some participants do not represent an average citizen that is welcoming others and behaving in a polite manner and, you know, trying to collaborate more than being confronting and being angry to others? I don't know. Yeah.
Yes, sadly, yes, some of them are not. I agree with you. On the whole, I think that people come from a good place. And I'd like to think that when people don't act well together, it's because they don't understand differences and expectations. I'm not going to go into details here, but I once witnessed a conflict myself between people from two different cultures, where a person from one culture was using language that is very common in theirs without understanding how disruptive and insulting it was to the other person. But unfortunately, yeah, we do have some people, particularly as we have grown in influence around the world, there are some people who come into this movement who are not coming from the wanting to be welcoming, wanting to be helpful space. Trust and safety operations, in my opinion, should be dealing mostly with those people, and the community should be able to deal with the people who want to be welcoming, but just aren't quite knowing how. So my hope is that as we move forward into UCOC phase 2, I'm just going to lay it out here. If I could make UCOC phase 2, we'd spend a lot of time teaching people who don't behave well why it's a problem and how they could behave better. Because we don't all have the same competencies, but that doesn't mean they're bad people. Sometimes it just means that they need to understand how to act in a certain environment.
Okay, thank you.
So you just mentioned, Maggie, that if you could design phase 2, you would make that kind of instructional support central in helping people understand how they can just behave better on the projects and work better with other people. Curious to know how that will factor in, or if you envision anything like that factoring in the future.
Well, you know, I don't know, because the UCSC phase 2, as my team knows, I am trying to be very hands-off in terms of content, because it's really important to me that this not look like something where Maggie comes in and says, I want this in a code. I haven't even read the code draft, probably somewhat to Patrick's shock, but I wanted to be sure that I didn't go, wait, I disagree with this because it's not my code. With phase 2, it is my hope that that the operations team, if the people who handle behavioral issues, can also participate in the conversations, not as a super group who's going to be influencing the outcomes, but rather as somebody who can come in and say, well, we've dealt with these kinds of things, and that might help us come up with something. So let me back up and see if I can remember what you asked me, because I think I fell down a rabbit hole. Do I hope it will factor in? Yeah, I've been spending a lot of time since I got my new job title, Community Resilience and Sustainability. And I've been thinking about how resilience and sustainability works, what makes a community sustainable. And I think it is important to come from a place that assumes that people mean well, but that also gives them the tools to do better. As a volunteer, I used to focus a lot on copyright cleanup. And I had to block, I've blocked hundreds of people from English Wikipedia, where I was home myself, because they would not respect copyright, but I never did so without trying to teach them how to do it right first. Because I believe that inclusivity is how we will be a sustainable, resilient community. And I think that means acknowledging that some people do need guidance in some areas, and that includes how to get along with others. I will also admit that I'm sitting in the United States through the most contentious and difficult election I've ever seen, and I am shocked and appalled by the way that my neighbors are treating each other. And I wish we had a code of conduct. But anyway, there you go. I will pause for more questions.
Finding examples in the real world of where a universal code of conduct would better serve us as human beings and as a society. Absolutely. Okay, great. I have a question about training materials more broadly, so not just about behavioral training materials, but more broadly. You mentioned earlier the idea of developing training materials. So what do you mean by this? And there are a couple follow-up questions. So what do you mean by this? Is this an expansion of the modules at the meta page for the trust and safety resources, or is this about keeping events safe pamphlets? What are these materials, and what might they help support?
Okay. Probably the person who asked me this was trying to be nice to me and give me an easy question, but here's where I have to look stupid. So community development came under my management approximately 2 weeks ago. So I haven't managed them since community engagement was separated. So I have not yet dug into their portfolio to see what their immediate plans are. That is my first, I may say something that Simona, the manager of that team, if she were here, would wish I didn't. But yes, it means expanding training modules, but it also means creating a platform where people are more easily able to upload modules of their own. It means recognizing the expertise that comes to like learning days events can also be hosted online. So I probably shouldn't try to get too deep into the weeds on that before I do wind up saying something that Simona will regret because she's not here to answer. But if there's follow-up on that, I will be happy to ask Simona to be more public about that. And we're going to be talking more about it as we move forward with updating the meta pages, which clearly I need to do because crisis response doesn't exist.
Okay, great. Yeah, the follow-up question here is how can we get involved? Maybe when we do the notes from this meeting, there can be a link or something to allow people to follow up if they're interested in that.
Good idea. I will talk to Simona to see if I can get more from her than I was able to say. Last time I posted the notes from this on Meta and included also some follow-up materials that people reached out to me after the fact. And I will ask her if she can give more accurate information than I could. And I will make sure that that gets in and anybody who is interested is able to get more information.
Thank you. All right, we're going back to the UCOC, a question from the Zoom room. In practice, what do you think the outcome will be of situations where the UCOC explicitly contradicts local consensus-backed policy?
I like that question because it makes me think. And well, first, I hope that won't happen. And if it does, I hope it won't happen around a core values-based issue. So for example, do I want to give that example? It's kind of actual. No. All right. I better not go there because it's a real case. But some communities have had policies that are not in line with the movement values overall. If a local consensus-backed policy were completely contrary to movement values, I think my hope would be that the UCOC Phase 2 creates a process whereby the consensus of the local community can be reviewed by a broader consensus, whether that is some kind of global policy arbitration committee, I don't know, some meta format. It's important to me that we respect local consensus where possible, but it's also important for me that we don't deify it to the point where we say, well, the locals have agreed this is okay, it's okay. And again, I come out of the English Wikipedia and I know a little bit more about them, so please excuse me if I refer to English Wikipedia. I know they're not all the same, but in English Wikipedia, there is an idea that the consensus of a few doesn't overturn the consensus of many. So a small group of editors can agree to one thing that the larger group, the larger community can overturn. So I hope it would be something similar to that.
Interesting. Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's the first that I've heard about a different consensus mechanism to try to reconcile some of those differences that could arise. Does that fully answer your question, Yair? I know you're here in the Zoom room. If you wanted to unmute, I can also just ask the follow-up you've put in the chat. I'll give you a second if you want to unmute and ask yourself. I know you did ask some questions live last time, and if not, I will read this out.
Oh.
Okay, not unmuting today. Great, no problem.
Okay.
So the example that Yair is pointing to is English Wiki News' specific rejection of assume good faith, which is included in the draft in favor of its own never assume.
Okay, so, all right, let's pretend that I'm in charge of UCOC Phase 2 for a minute, and that in fact Phase 2 looks exactly like I want it to. I think that, first of all, I've said before, I'll say it again, in order for the Universal Code of Conduct to work, it can't be codified and never touched. We have to look at it and make sure that it's effective, because policies reflect the best intention of people to change thought to language on page, and things go wrong between what I'm thinking and what I wrote and what you're reading. So to me, we should be, and we've committed to reviewing this thing later if it's ratified by the board, to make sure that it's functional. So I think that would be a case where, again, if I were in charge of Phase 2 all by myself, I'd say, why do they have a never assume, and how is it contradictory to the UCOC, and is there a way that we can get at what is meant by both of them that actually is in benefit to the movement at large? So I think that for me, that would be a question of the ongoing value of the document and the ongoing value of local policies. I imagine this is the kind of thing where we may get to do that a lot. Although perhaps not. Again, I haven't read the draft, so I'm not sure what it specifically says about assume good faith. But if it's similar to English Wikipedia, I have a guess.
Thank you. Looks like that answered the question. We can wait a little bit for more questions to come in queue. I do have one more personal question that was submitted for you. What is your most memorable edit as a volunteer to a Wikimedia project?
I like that question. My most memorable edits are the ones that embarrass me. I have a bad habit, which I've always had, of switching words in my brain, which makes sense. You know, I just talked about getting thought onto paper can go weird places. So sometimes what I type is not what I mean, and sometimes what I type is funnier than what I meant. Like for one example, and I put this on my user page, I once wanted to write that a copyright problem had been reworded, as in I had changed the wording, but I wrote, it's been rewarded. So those are the kind of edits that I can't forget. But other than that, if let me go to something slightly more proud. I am proud of the first article that I ever edited, even though it wound up with me leaving Wikimedia for a while. I read a book. It was a very good book. I don't remember exactly what it was, but it had something to do with the civil rights movement in my state. And I went and looked at the Wikipedia article on it, and it was substantially different than what I had read. So I went into the article, I made changes, I sourced it to the book to the best of my ability. This was my very first edit on English Wikipedia. Somebody thanked me for this on my IP talk page because I wasn't registered, and I got a "you've got a message" banner on my screen, and I thought, oh my goodness, these people have hacked my computer. And I did not go back to Wikipedia for months. So that also will stand in my memory forever. Now I wish I could remember that article, because I cannot remember what particular topic it was, and I've never been able to find it again. I'd like to go back and see, did I do as good a job as I thought I did when I didn't know the rules or how things were formatted, or was it a complete mess and somebody was just nice?
I hope you shared that experience with the new editors team as like
I did.
Major deterrent to you.
Yes. Of all the things to be scared by, somebody trying to be nice to me. I also left a nice little note to the person who dropped a thank you auto message on my user talk page, I think, before I realized that this was a bot. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm not supposed to read the chat questions because last time I responded to them without telling people what they were.
Yeah, don't jump the gun. Let me read the chat question, okay? We'll read it out loud so across channels, everybody gets to know what we're talking about. This is, well, it's a request, I would say, more than a question, but I think it's worth engaging. So the request here is, please do something about coverage from parts of the world which are oral societies, where finding printed online citations is never an easy task. this is not an appeal for lower standards, but appeal to recognize that a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't necessarily work. So this may not fall entirely within the TNS realm, but I'm sure that you have some thoughts on how we can go about this better as a volunteer or as a staff member.
I do have thoughts. In fact, I have passionate thoughts about this, but I will correct you. I'm not TNS, I'm CR&S. Keep up with my new initials.
Have you updated your meta page to reflect that, though?
Yes, I have.
Oh, no.
Yes.
Okay.
So yeah, it is not actually part of my current job responsibilities, but it is something I've thought about, especially when I was in community engagement, where I had what I thought was a great idea of a project that I still wish I could have made happen. I really wanted to create some sort of a project for oral story recording, you know, some of the kind of thing that archaeologists do. I know there are problems around that. There's copyright problems, there's libel problems, but I didn't want to think about how to fix those problems. I just thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could send young people around the world out to talk to the elders in their societies and capture their stories while they're still with us? I'd love to see that happen. If we could find some way. Now, in terms of sourcing it on Wikipedia, that's a tricky, delicate subject that I think eventually we as a movement may need to grapple with. But for now, if I had a magic wand, we would have a project where these stories could be captured while these people are still here to tell them, because every day we lose more. So I don't know if that's the kind of thing you're thinking about, but I'm with you. I'm not going to forget that possibility.
Thanks for sharing your passion and thoughts on that. Okay, well, the one question I have in queue is about another one of your passions, ice cream. Last time you mentioned favorite ice cream. What are your favorite toppings?
Caramel. And in fact, I have been known to go to places where they offer, like there's one of my favorite ice cream shops offers hot fudge, caramel, and nuts. And I say, can I just have triple caramel? In fact, I don't even need the ice cream. Just give me caramel.
And they do that for you. That's great.
Yeah, they do that. Most places will do anything if you give them money.
Cool. All right, well, let's wait a little bit to see if any other questions come in across channels. We have a very lively discussion in the Zoom chat about caramel. People seem to agree.
I also see that Rajiv is working on an oral project, which is really exciting. So I'm glad to hear that you are thinking about that.
All right. Another question in the Zoom chat. Don't read it. Don't answer without reading it. Maggie, let me read it first. I see you starting to talk. Question. What do you think is the hardest challenge that CR&S, right, is facing right now, or trust and safety specifically, CR&S, your team? I'll leave it at that. What is the toughest challenge your team is facing right now?
I'm going to back up because Yaron asked one right before that one came in, so I'm going to answer him. He said, you know, there are still places where you're listed as being the WMS general contact person. The visible shock you saw on my face was, there are? Did you have a successor for that position? The general contact address for the foundation is answers@wikimedia.org. And I do have a successor, but instead of replicating the mistake of saying, contact Maggie Dennis, we connected it to the email address so that when that changes, it's easier to find. Yeah, so, oh gosh, yes. So we need to change to make sure that I'm not listed as a general contact person, because my inbox can be a real mess sometimes and I'd be scared I'd miss it. So thank you.
We have a lot of updating to do, it sounds like.
Yes.
So I hope someone's keeping the list of all the places we have to update.
Yeah. And then
I can just quickly, I can vouch that Answers That is a great system. I help monitor that inbox and respond to questions and make sure that people get the answers to the questions they ask from any team that they need answers from. So highly recommend emailing Answers That with anything that you have questions about.
Right. Okay. And so the question that came in was the hardest challenge TNS is facing right now. That's a really good question, because there's a couple of ways I could go with that. And it might depend on how I'm feeling at any given moment. All right. So let's talk about UCOC briefly, because I think probably this is the hardest challenge. And it's not just the hardest challenge facing TNS, it's the hardest challenge facing the whole movement. We all, I assume, want a fair system where people feel supported, where people feel safe, where people don't feel railroaded, where the work is handled at the appropriate level. And this is hard. And again, sitting where I am in my own country, watching horrible things happen and watching my neighbors fight with each other over some things that I thought were given, I've reached the point of feeling that pulling together a global system to address conflict may be the hardest thing I'm ever going to be involved in my life. So I'm optimistic, though, because I do believe that most people in the movement are coming from a very good place. Most people really want to share knowledge. And to me, there is no more noble goal than that. I know there are some people who are here because they want to manipulate information, but sharing knowledge, right? We're teachers. We're doing potentially amazing things, but figuring out how to deal with conflicts between the people who do this work is hard. It touches people in a very personal place. It scares them. It makes them angry. And I get that, because I understand that. I feel many of the same ways, especially outside of that context in my own country. So I think that is the biggest challenge facing us, how we are supposed to shepherd an international community into coming up with approaches that work, which is one of the reasons, frankly, why I think it is so important that we don't ever reach a point where we say, this is done. It is so important to me that whatever systems we come up with are open to change as we find out what works and doesn't work. Because the worst thing is if we have to say, this is the way it is, and we get it wrong.
Thanks for that.
Yeah. Somebody also I saw, and I'm just going to repeat this, I saw somebody reached out to me in a complete side chat and said, wait, what is the difference between TNS and CR&S? CR&S is me and everybody who works under me. TNS works under me, and there are wings under TNS. So I know it's confusing. It's just the titles. Trust and safety is under community resilience and sustainability, but I am also community development, and I will also be human rights. So
a new umbrella term.
Yeah, it's not my first, probably won't be my last.
That's helpful for me too. Thank you.
Yes, we have a public page with the staffing listed, but you're right. Frankly, it would be helpful to me too. Oh, I did it again. I answered the question.
The comment was, the foundation really needs a public org chart. So would you like to react to that again?
Yes, we need one. I'd like one, because sometimes I need to reach out to people in other teams and it's hard to figure out who I want to talk to. It is challenging as the organization has grown. To figure out how much time goes into this versus how much time goes into other stuff. But I at least want to commit to getting CR&S's pages up to date and pull out some of the work that I'm not actually going to be doing in the near future. So at the very least, I can offer you that. We have 7 minutes, and so far I've survived.
Doing great. Doing great.
I wouldn't believe how scared I am of public speaking.
All right, we have one question coming in.
Oh, exciting. It's probably going to be the hard one.
Okay. I would say medium difficulty with opportunities to expand.
Okay.
how do you balance the openness of the foundation's work and the transparency with the personal risks of doing this CR&S work? So openness and transparency on one hand and personal risk on the other.
That's hard. That is very hard. And I'm going to say that we have recently been grappling with the amount of exposure that trust and safety staff have and are having to figure out how to be as transparent as we possibly can while not putting people out in front of some of the worst actors. I am very happy to say that, well, I don't know if I'm very happy to say this. That sounds like a very weird lead in. I hope some of you will never know how bad it can get. There are some very bad people in the world. And unfortunately, some of them target people in our movement. And it is a job we take very seriously to try to step in the way of that and protect people however we can. And if we are too transparent about who's doing that work, we create risk for those people on the ground. So it's a challenge. And what we are looking towards is being a little bit less public about who some of the staff is who's doing this work. There's a downside to that in that it might also reduce trust for the team, especially because, frankly, some of the trust issues come with the community saying trust and safety staff don't know us. But at this writing, all of the operations team come out of community, and some of them are very, very experienced from within the community. So it would be much easier to go, look, this is the person who's doing this, but not if that puts them into the firing sights of some of these really bad actors. So it's a challenge. And it's a challenge I myself grappled with. I've become much more public in the last few years. When I first started at the foundation, the fear of that public exposure was a real one for me, and it still is to some extent. I've seen people doxxed here. I've seen people's children's lives threatened, and it's a pretty big responsibility to take on for your family, not just yourself.
Absolutely. Yeah, you mentioned quickly the value that it has to be able to put the name and the face in front of community, to be able to say, see, this is somebody you know, this is somebody you trust, as, you know, kind of like a trust building mechanism. Given that we may be moving away from that to protecting people's personal identities more, what are some other alternatives you've thought about in terms of building that trust between the people who are doing that work behind the scenes and the community?
Well, Der Hexer just suggested one in writing, which, yeah, okay. With the case review committee, we did mention years of experience in the community, edits, et cetera. So yeah, that's a possibility. We could talk about how these people know. Now, I'm not saying that we cannot hire people with trust and safety backgrounds outside of the movement who can be great. And in fact, when some people have pushed back on me for saying that, I would say, you know what, 15 years ago, I was outside of the movement. Now I have over 100,000 edits. I've written over 400 articles. We're all new at some point. But I do believe that community experience, whether it's before or after hiring, is really super helpful in understanding, what it's actually like to be on the ground. And this is helpful because it's very frustrating sometimes to be in the community, and understanding that when you're dealing with trolls, you might snap is really helpful if you're evaluating the behavior of the person who snapped. So I think I started to answer your question, but I might have lost it at the end.
Well, just for people who aren't in Zoom, the suggestion was to handle this in a similar way to CRC, about mentioning the people behind the scenes, their years of experience in the community, their edits, et cetera, as an alternative to openly talking about who they are or revealing their identities. So that's one possibility. I don't know if you've thought of any other ways that trust could really be built in those people in the context of their identities still being protected more publicly.
I haven't, honestly. I really don't think, though, that the challenge to trust is knowing who people are as much as it is wondering whether they made the right decision. And this is a very difficult trust gap to bridge when we can't share often the reason for why the decisions were made. So that we're hoping to do with a case review committee, but I realize that's a problem too, because we can't share who those people are, at least not until after they're done with the committee. So I'm open to ideas. I see your Rand tossed in usernames. That's possible, but for some people, unfortunately, the username is not so hard to connect to real life identities. So yeah.
It's not always entirely protective. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, we have one more minute and we have one more question from the YouTube chat. What measures or examples are there to curb the infiltration of people who maybe don't deserve to be in the community, but are deeply rooted in the community?
Measures or examples? Right now, I would say the communities are the front line on this. There are like arbitration committees, there are senior users around the world who sometimes have to make very hard decisions about deeply embedded volunteers who are not a net positive and who are not open to being guided into different ways of behavior. At this point, too, the foundation sometimes steps in where there are long-term community members who have proven untouchable by local communities. This is, of course, controversial and problematic because local communities would prefer to be able to address these things themselves. So I would say the measures right now are look to your local communities, right to trust and safety. If your local communities are not able, understand that as much as possible, we're hoping to move this into phase 2 of the UCOC, where there's a process whereby this stuff is handled by volunteers in a safe and secure manner.
Great, thanks so much for that answer. So we are at time. Thank you to everybody who came with questions and those of you who came to listen. It was a really great conversation. I feel like I learned a lot. Maggie, do you want to walk through what the plan is in terms of getting the notes up, and if any additional questions come in, where can people expect to find that information?
Okay, so the notes will be linked from the office hours page on Meta, which is where I linked them last time. The office hours page has a listing for every office hour, and the notes will be linked from them. I don't know how fast we'll get them up. I'll be honest with y'all. I only thought about surviving the hour. After the hour, I have to sit down and think, okay, when do we get the notes out? But we'll be doing it as quickly as possible. If you have follow-up questions, write them to answers at. Last time, I took a few questions after the fact because I didn't want people to have to wait for a whole quarter. I do plan to be coming back to do this quarterly. And I thank you for not letting me sit in awkward silence too long, because that's killer. So I appreciate all of you who ask questions.
Just a little bit of awkward silence, just enough to build character, I think. All right, well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, Elena.